you've identified from a young age as an anarchist, and during that time, the popularity of anarchism has fallen and risen. And I wonder if your core philosophy, your anarchism, has evolved or changed during the course of your life.
Well, it's not what it was when I was 10 years old, but fundamentally not. But that's because the core philosophy just seems to me like common sense. I don't see how anybody can not accept it. So, the core principles, as far as I understand it, but I mean, anarchism covers an extremely wide range, and all sorts of you can't encapsulate it in formulas. But it seems to me there is a sort of a thread that runs through it, and it is basically skepticism about any form of authority or domination or submission or whatever. And the basic idea is that domination and hierarchy are not self-justifying. They have to justify themselves. There's a burden of proof to bear. And if they can't justify themselves, they should be dismantled. And that covers everything from personal relations to international affairs. And then out of that come various varieties of anarchism, depending on what exactly you're looking for in the future. What are the alternatives to authority, and so on. But almost everything decent in human life seems to me to fall under that. So no, that hasn't changed.
Well, the tendency of anarchism, which I guess you subscribe to, of anarcho-syndicalism, overlaps fairly closely with council communism around this notion of worker councils. And for the public at large, the assumption is that an anarchist society would be one where people ran amok, where there was chaos. That's
the propaganda. Actually, anarchist views are mostly of highly organized societies.
So what would that society look like, a society of worker councils?
Worker councils, I think, should be one component of it. So it means in any institution, say a university or a factory or whatever it is, the participants would run it. They'd run it through councils in which people participate and make decisions. Actually, it's not unlike a faculty, which is about as close to this model as you get in our world, where it's there are outside controls, but pretty much the faculty makes decisions about what happens internally. Actually, one of the things that makes university life appealing, much more so than higher paid professions, is that you're running your own life to a large extent. I mean, there are duties, but they're supposed to be shared, and shared by common agreement. And you may decide to work 80 hours a week, but it's the 80 hours that you pick, and it's the topics that you choose to work on, and it comes out of kind of like an inner need rather than external compulsion. And I think that's the kind of model everything should turn towards. So worker councils would be one component of a freely organized society, but they'd have to interact with others. So an institution, say a factory, whatever it is in a community, and the community should have a comparable form of self-organization and self-management, and then they have to interact. And it's complex interactions because many people are parts of a lot of them. As an anarchist society, the kind that I think is desirable, would develop, it would have to deal with quite concrete problems about the nature of self-government, the nature of administration. Do you want to distribute jobs so that they're fixed, or do you want circulation of responsibilities and actions? And there's no simple answer to that. Like, you want people to be trained as surgeons, let's say. On the other hand, you don't want all the dirty work done by a special category of people. So that has to be worked out. Distribution of job functions and interactions between different forms of what should be voluntary association. And there are many other problems, like what happens if somebody doesn't want to be part of take on the responsibilities of a community. I mean, those are problems that exist in any society, and they would exist in a different form in a more free society. And at this point, you have lots of different ideas. So there are people, who, basically anarchists, who think that payment, what you earn from your work, should be proportional to effort. There are others who think that's not an appropriate model, that it should be independent of effort. I tend toward the latter, but most of my friends tend toward the former. So, but these are real questions, and they're innumerable ones.
Well, thinking about the road to a stateless society, an anarchist society, you have written that you believe that radicals should defend those gains which have been fought for by people that are embodied in the state, such as social security, such as progressive taxation. Other anarchists might argue that this holds people within the kind of paternalistic grip of the state. Why do you come down where you do on this?
You have to ask what the alternatives are. I mean, many anarchists just consider the state the fundamental form of oppression. I think that's a mistake. I mean, of the various kinds of oppressive institutions that exist, the state is among the least of them. The state, at least, to the extent that the society is democratic, various degrees and types, but to the extent that it's democratic, you have some influence on what happens in the state. You have no influence on what happens in a corporation. They're real tyrannies. And as long as society is largely dominated by private tyrannies, which is the worst form of oppression, people just need some form of self-defense, and the state provides some form of self-defense. So to say, well, let's dismantle Social Security means concretely let's decide that disabled widow across town will starve to death. And I don't agree with that.
In recent years, there's been a fair amount of debate about what process of fundamental transformation of society might take, what would it look like. There are those who argue that radicals need to change the world without taking power, and another position is that a revolution of some kind would be necessary. What do you think with regard to this, and do you see the role of pre-existing state formations, say nationalized industries, as playing some part in such a transformation?
I don't think there's a general answer. It depends a lot on circumstances. So, say right now, I think it would make, say with the bailout of the banks, a short-term, a dedicated anarchist might say, look, I'm not even going to talk about this, there shouldn't be any banks. That's like saying, I'm not going to talk about getting rid of nuclear weapons because everyone should live in peace. I mean, life, these things are kind of like a chess game. There's no point coming in and saying, well, I just want to mate the king. No, you got to say, well, what do you do about that pawn over there? You have to get places in stages. It's just a gift to the forces of oppression to say, well, I'm not going to talk about anything except the final state. Okay, then fine, we'll keep things as they are. So sometimes nationalization might be a positive step. Say, for the government to have, say, bought Citigroup, I think would have made more sense for them to bail it out at a far greater expense. Once it's bought, then the question comes, okay, how's it run? Is it run by the community, by its participants? Is it sold off to some other corporation, and so on? But I just don't see how there could be a general answer. You have to ask about the particular circumstances. Like I say, if you're playing chess, you have to ask about the pawn that happens to be in front of you.
One of the currents within anarchism in the US is a current which does not see class as a central axis for understanding society and thinking about a future society. Why do you think that this tendency has gotten some traction? and why do you not agree with it?
It's gotten some traction because of the decline, because the class struggle which exists has just become one-sided. I mean, there's one group of people who are basically vulgar Marxists and who are dedicated to class struggle constantly. That's the business class. It's a highly class-conscious business class. They're fighting a bitter class-conscious struggle all the time. Well, if everyone else has said, I'm going to worry about something else, they win. And that's, it's become an attractive position, for one thing, because it allows you to focus your attention on things that are quite important, but aren't going to change the class struggle. Take, say, gay rights. It's a good cause. It can be working on gay rights, but if gays had 100% rights, the institutional structure of oppression, the core of it would remain unchanged. Actually, you can see that in, say, take South Africa. Overthrowing apartheid was a major achievement, but for the majority of the population, it didn't mean a lot. Okay, now there are black faces in the limousines, but the townships are as awful or worse as they are where the class structure remained. It's just kind of one aspect of it softened, so now it's not strict white-black. Same with, and it's, there's less resistance from power centers to trying to right cultural and social wrongs than there is to trying to modify the fundamental core properties of oppression and domination. So it's easy to drift into those. And it's not wrong. I mean, it's right. Yes, you should deal with these things. But the class struggle is not going to go away unless you abandon it and say, okay, they win.
Well, switching gears slightly, I wanted to ask you about your view of science. Of course, this interview is being conducted in your office at MIT. How do you understand science? Do you think that it's socially or politically neutral?
To a degree. I mean, of course, it's influenced by outside forces. I mean, like where the science goes, where the money is, it has to. I mean, it doesn't, if, say, in my field, you can work with pencil and paper, but if you're in the chemistry lab, you just have to get money. Otherwise, you can't do anything. And the money comes from one of several sources. It could come from the government. It could come from a private corporation. That's about it. Those are the basic sources of money, and which you pick and what you do does affect the work you do. It's also what you do is affected by general cultural attitudes. So it's been argued with some plausibility, I think, that, say, in the way evolution is interpreted has been influenced by the kind of society in which evolutionary theory is developed. It's been argued with some, some degree of plausibility. I don't know how much, that the competitive, nature is red in tooth and claw, social Darwinian approach to evolution is affected by the fact that it developed within a competitive state capitalist society. One very well-known biologist who's argued this is Zinn, whose work was on symbiogenesis, arguing that species change takes place not by competition and defeat of some genes by others, but by incorporating genetic genomes essentially into other organisms, bacteria. So it's kind of a cooperative mode of evolution, if you like. It's possible that those things are influenced by general social, cultural values, and the fact that, say, nuclear physics developed is not unrelated to the fact that the military wanted, nuclear weapons. But by and large, I think science develops from its own internal needs. I mean, you can only work on the problems that are at the borders of understanding. It's one of the reasons why Pentagon supported science like MIT, like me, say, that tended to be the most free. The MIT, say, in the 60s was about 100% Pentagon funded. I was working in a lab that was 100% funded by the three armed services. It was also one of the country's centers of resistance, and there was no real conflict over that. Pentagon was funding in their view, they were, I presume, funding the development of the next stage of the economy. And from our view, we were working on things that looked interesting. So the two more or less mesh. There's some influence from one on the other.
Since the 1970s, postmodernism has had a great deal of influence on at least part of the left in this country, and it has been characterized by, among other things, as being quite critical of science and of the Enlightenment tradition. I wonder if you could talk about your view of postmodernism and whether you think that its influence is waning.
I have to say that a lot of postmodern work I just don't understand, so I can't comment on it. It seems to me some exercise by intellectuals who are talking to each other in very obscure ways, and I can't follow it, and I don't know if anybody else can. Postmodern views of science, by and large, have been pretty embarrassing, I think. There's some interesting work on this. There's a book by two physicists, Jean Bricmont and Alan Sokal, both of whom happen to be political radicals, just running through, it's mostly Paris postmodernism, what postmodern commentators have said about science. And it is really embarrassing. To the extent you can understand it. On the other hand, there is a point. Insofar as they say that everything that people do is some kind of social construction, depends on the historical context, cultural context, that part's true. I don't know if you need the whole postmodern baggage to say those things. My feeling is not. At least, personally, I haven't seen anything that it doesn't seem to me has to be said in anything but monosyllables. It looks, insofar as I understand it, it's pretty straightforward. And I get the feeling that it's kind of, there isn't a drive among intellectuals to make things look difficult. It's a kind of self-protection. If what I'm doing can be done by, the guy who's repairing my furnace, okay, then who am I, And then there's those physicists over there who talk complicated things and have to, and I don't understand them, so I'd like to be like them. That drive is clearly there, and I think it should be resisted. If we can say things simply so that people can understand them, we should.
Postmodernism has also been characterized by a fairly fierce attack on the legacy of the Enlightenment.
Yeah, I have no idea what that means. I'm happy to be part of the legacy of the Enlightenment.
Well, that's what I want to ask you about. In some circles, quite an unpopular stance to take, but what does that mean to you to continue in some way the legacy of the Enlightenment?
Well, Enlightenment, like any major movement in human life, was pretty complicated, but among its major features were commitment to ideas that I think are basically anarchist. So take, say, ideas about, take division of labor, and let's take a typical Enlightenment figure, Adam Smith. What did he have to say about division of labor? Well, here it's worth reading. Everyone's read the first paragraph of Wealth of Nations, which, Butcher does his thing, and everybody does their own thing, everything comes out fine. So division of labor is marvelous. On the other hand, if you read in a few hundred pages, he comes out as a figure of the Enlightenment. He says, division of labor will turn human beings into creatures as stupid and ignorant as a person can possibly be, because it'll drive them into repeating rote work on command. And therefore, in any civilized society, he says, the government will have to move in to stop it. Well, that's a version of a standard Enlightenment idea that your own intelligence and creative abilities derive from what you do. If Wilhelm von Humboldt, one of the founders of what we call classical liberalism, but again, a figure of the Enlightenment, he encapsulated it by saying that if a craftsperson does, he'd say craftsman, of course, if a craftsman produces a beautiful object on command, we may admire what he does, but we'll despise what he is. He's a creature, he's a tool under somebody else's control, like a machine that's producing a beautiful object. If we want that person to be a real human being, they should be doing things under their own internal impulses. And then if it creates, even maybe it's not a beautiful object, we'll still admire what the person is. Well, that's an Enlightenment idea. It grows out of conception of human intelligence, human creativity. I think it's a very good ideal. Same with some values like, say, freedom of speech. I think we should preserve that. And even the questioning of authority and dominance, that's core Enlightenment values. So I don't see what's wrong with that.
Well, I want to ask you about another set of ideas, perhaps as labyrinthine as postmodern ones, which are conspiracy theories, which have become quite popular amongst those people who identify as progressive. I know you've been fairly critical of those ideas. Why do you think that they're popular now?
Well, first of all, there are conspiracies, no question about it. In fact, sometimes sometimes they have big effects. Like take the suburbanization of America, the huge government, state, corporate social engineering projects, which were largely dedicated to maximizing the inefficient use of fossil fuels, with everything that goes along with it. Well, that may destroy the species, so it's not insignificant. But it did start as a literal conspiracy of General Motors, Standard Oil of California, and Firestone Rubber to buy up and destroy the fairly efficient electric transport system in Los Angeles and other cities, destroy it and turn it into the monstrosity that we have. Okay, that was a conspiracy. In fact, they were taken to court and fined a couple $1,000. But looking for something hidden that's sort of beneath the surface, that's really running things, I think that's sometimes it's true, but usually it's, in my view, it turns out to be a pathology. And I think it comes from a sense that I don't like the way things are, and so there must be some hidden hand somewhere that's manipulating and controlling it. Whereas when you look closely, I think you just see the normal workings of institutional structures. That makes you, of course, raise questions about the nature of the society, who we are, how we tolerate it, and so on. So, for example, it's appealing to believe that, say, John F. Kennedy, one of the main figures in conspiracy theory, what are called conspiracy theories, it would be nice to believe he's just a fantastically wonderful guy who's going to do all kind of great things, and they shot him down just because he was so wonderful, and the world has gone off, hell in a handbasket ever since then. That's a comforting feeling. It's less comforting to recognize what I think the documentary record demonstrates in the historical record, that he was a kind of a hawk who was a politician, trying to gain power by the usual techniques. He was kind of affable and friendly and smiled and knew how to butter people up. But if you take a look at what he was doing, it was pretty horrible. He was one of the worst, most dangerous creatures of the 20th century. And fortunately, it didn't happen to blow up the world, but it came pretty close to it. That's a less comforting position. I happen to think it's largely true. Same with Barack Obama. But you can see the appeal of trying to find, take, say, Obama. There's a widespread feeling on the left, Middle Eastern commentators and so on, that he's really dedicated doing wonderful things. It's just that dark forces are preventing it. So we just have to hope that he's going to overcome the dark forces in like a hero in a fairy tale and somehow get rid of the witches and dragons and everything will be nice. I don't think that there's any truth to that. That's exactly what he seems to be. And nobody's going to ride in on a white horseback and get rid of the dragons and the witches. Got to do it ourselves. That's harder.
Right. So would you say that conspiracy theories in general are not particularly helpful for radical politics and radical action?
If they're inaccurate. I mean, if they're accurate, as they sometimes are, sure, that helps explain the world. But most of what happens is, it's kind of, in a sense, it's a conspiracy. If the board of directors of General Motors get together and decide, okay, here's our plans for next year, well, it's kind of a conspiracy, but we don't call that a conspiracy theory because it's the normal working of institutions. And similarly, when take, say, during the Second World War, the high State Department planners and comparable figures from the private sector, like the Council on Foreign Relations, did meet and extensively discuss the nature of the post-war world and laid plans which were pretty well executed. Well, this happened to be public, but is it a conspiracy? They got together, they worked out plans, they later implemented them, small group of people, they have special interests, not the interests of the population, but exposing that makes perfect sense. That's not what's called a conspiracy theory, because that's the way institutions operate. And that makes sense. On the other hand, I don't like to use the term because there are conspiracies. It's called a conspiracy theory if we don't like it or something. It's not the way to look at it. What you have to ask is whether the theories of a conspiracy are accurate. So let's take, say, the idea that the Bush administration plotted to blow up the World Trade Center. That attracts huge support. Maybe a third of the population believes it, and very dedicated groups of people, many of them on the left, are just committed to that. Well, is it plausible? Suppose that let's say somebody conspired to blow up the World Trade Center. We know what they did. They blamed it on Saudis. Would the Bush administration blame it on Saudis, thereby shooting themselves in the feet? If they wanted to bomb Iraq, so if they'd organized it, they would have blamed it on Iraqis. Then they'd have no problem at all getting congressional authorization, a UN resolution. NATO would join in. Everybody'd say, "Fine, let's invade Iraq." Instead, whoever did it blamed it on Saudis. Well, that absolves the Bush administration, short of outright insanity. Why harm your relations with a valued ally instead of blaming it on the people you want to invade? So that's already a barrier to even entertaining the possibility. And the elaborate work that goes into, is there nanothermite in building 7 or whatever it is, it's kind of beside the point. Yeah, maybe there was, maybe there wasn't, unless you have pretty sophisticated knowledge of civil engineering and structural architecture. You can't even make a judgment as to whether it means anything. But there are obvious, clear phenomena that the theory has to deal with somehow, and doesn't. And if it doesn't, I don't see a reason to take it seriously. So yes, then it becomes one of these kinds of conspiracy theory that just mislead and misdirect energy and so on. In fact, it wouldn't surprise me if, say, 40 years from now, we get declassified documents which show that the Bush administration was very sympathetic to these theories. It was diverting energy from real crimes into things that are basically a wild goose chase. Actually, we have documents like that about the Kennedy assassination. So there are Pentagon advisory documents which advise the Pentagon, the government, to periodically leak information about the Kennedy assassination, basically so as to keep people out of our hair. Let them follow those non-existent leads instead of asking us questions that we really don't want to answer.
So real conspiracy theory there.
And there we have the actual documents, and it wouldn't shock me if there's similar things about 9/11 conspiracies. I mean, they do have an immediate effect. They draw a lot of energy and effort away from major crimes, the crimes which are a lot worse than blowing up the World Trade Center. So that's convenient for the powerful. And since the theories seem to have just major logical problems that I don't see how they confront, like what I mentioned, it does seem to me the kind of theory that misleads and misdirects. And it's not hard to see why it's popular. I mean, some terrible things are going on. There should be some dark hand behind it. We hate Bush and Rumsfeld for good reasons, so maybe they're behind it.
Do you have time for me to ask you one short question? Okay, there's just one question I really want to ask you. And
there is a structure of authority here, and
yes.
Bev runs it, so I don't really have time.
Okay.
We'll sneak through.
We'll sneak it through really quickly. It seems indisputable that we're facing an ecological crisis, and there are obviously different currents within the radical left in terms of addressing it. One current within anarchism, known as narco-primitivism, associated with John Zinn and Derek Jensen, argues that the only way for the planet to survive is if we go back to pre-industrial societies or even pre-agrarian societies. What do you think of that kind of view?
That's a factual claim. I mean, if they happen to be right, then we have to be in favor of mass genocide on a scale that has never even been contemplated. Okay, what happens to the 6 billion people around? They can't live in a Stone Age society or an agricultural society. So if that factual claim happens to be correct, we're lost. It's not a prescription for action. I mean, nobody's proposing a course of action seriously that'll lead us to a pre-industrial society. I mean, you couldn't get 10 people to even listen to you if you suggested that. For a good reason, it means mass genocide. So it's not a prescription. It's a factual claim, which I doubt is correct. But if it happens to be correct, fine, then we're lost.
Okay, well, on that uplifting note, thank you so much for talking with me. I wonder if I could start by asking you how your own personal background has shaped your politics.
Well, I think with everybody, it's always a very difficult thing to trace your personal background and see how it's affected your politics. Because you know what I find? I find that very often there are people who seem to have similar personal backgrounds and different politics. And yet, obviously, there must be a connection. In my case, I think it's the fact that I grew up in a working class family, a struggling family. My father was a waiter. He met my mother when they were both immigrants, factory workers in New York, and I grew up in tenements and miserable places, and one step ahead of the landlord in the Depression years, so home was not a nice place to be. I remember the first time I walked into somebody's home who had a piano and the house looked clean and neat. I thought, wow, this is very nice. I never saw anything like this. No, home was no place to be. It was crowded and messy, and so we lived out on the street, really. I mean, that's, in poor neighborhoods, that's what you have. You have street life. Kids are out on the street. That's where they have their fun. That's where they meet their friends. And that's why when you walk out here in the suburbs and in middle-class neighborhoods, you don't see anybody on the street. They have nice homes. So yeah, I suppose that growing up in the Depression years, seeing people having a hard time, seeing people evicted from their homes. I have a vivid memory of seeing furniture piled up on the sidewalk outside of this family home, and a crowd gathering, and then the crowd facing off the police and moving the furniture back into the house. A very dramatic conflict. And but this was the kind of scene that I you don't forget. So you might say I was class conscious at an early age, without ever hearing the word class. And at the age of 18, instead of going to college, I went into work in a shipyard, in Brooklyn Navy Yard. And the kids in my neighborhood never went to college. They graduated from high school, or they dropped out of high school, and they went to work. Families needed the money, and families couldn't afford to send them to college, even though it was a free college, even though it was city college, No, they needed their kids' little salaries. And so I went to work in the Brooklyn Navy Yard for $14.40 a week, and worked there for 3 years. But in the meantime, I had become politically interested, involved, radicalized. I think by encountering young radicals on my street, and communists and members of the Young Communist League, and they were very political and very smart. They knew all about what was going on in Mexico. I was impressed by how much they knew. And I was interested in these things, but I didn't know as much as they did. I was reading books. I read at an early age. I think this is one of the important influences in my life, just starting to read at an early age, starting to read Dickens and Mark Twain when I was 13 or 14. My parents didn't know about books. There was no book in the house, not a single book in the house. No movie magazines my mother read, but no books. But I picked up books on the street, and read. So I was interested. I was reading about fascism and socialism, and so yes. By the time I went to the Navy Yard to work, I was already a political person. Well, in fact, just before that, I'd been in a demonstration in Times Square, which my communist friends took me to, my first demonstration, and it was exciting. I didn't know what a demonstration was. I thought going to Times Square would be fun, and so there were all these people milling around in Times Square, and at a certain moment they unfurled banners, and to this day I don't even know what the banners said. Probably stop fascism, stop war, something like that. It sounded okay to me. And then I heard sirens, and I thought there must be a fire somewhere. No, of course not. The police attacking the crowd, and this was important revelation to me. My God, police attacking these people, they're not doing anything, just marching and holding placards. Before I knew it, I was spun around, knocked on the head, knocked unconscious, actually. Woke up in a doorway, who knows when, an hour later? Times Square was as it had been before. Nobody, quiet, no demonstration. No, it was eerie. But it was a radicalizing moment for me. I thought, wow, these guys, these radicals, they're right. The state is not neutral. The police are not neutral. There is no real free speech in America, not if you antagonize the establishment. Anyway, so I guess what I'm saying is that even before I went to work in a shipyard at the age of 18, I was already politicized in a certain way. And then in the shipyard in Brooklyn Navy Yard, I encountered 3 other young fellows who were also young radicals, and the 4 of us set out to organize the young workers in the shipyard. And we did. We formed, because we were excluded from the union. The union was an AFL union, craft union. They only took in skilled workers, which meant that they were excluding blacks, because the black workers in the Navy Yard were the unskilled workers, but the heaviest work, riveters and chippers and nasty work. So the young apprentices were outside the union. We organized them, and meanwhile the war in Europe was going on, and soon the United States was in the war. And then my friends outside of the Navy Yard were going into the military, and because if you were in the Navy Yard, you didn't have to go in the military. You were doing important war work, building ships. I worked on the USS Iowa and the USS Missouri, and Missouri was later became famous because that's where the Japanese surrender was signed, and so on. Yeah, so we were doing important work, but I didn't want to stay in the Navy Yard. I wanted to get into the fray. Fascism, I almost said fascism beckoned. No. But the war against fascism beckoned. And then some of my friends were already in the military. And so I enlisted in the Air Force. And
how did that experience shape your political outlook?
Well, that's an interesting question of how the war itself shaped my political outlook, because I entered the Air Force as an enthusiastic bombardier. That's what I became, a bombardier on a heavy bomber stationed in England and flying missions over Germany and Hungary and Czechoslovakia and even France. And it was a good war. That's why I enlisted. War against fascism. It was very clear they were the bad guys. We were the good guys. But I began to have doubts, small doubts. Doubts first put into my head by a guy who was on another crew. A young fellow he was a gunner on another crew, and we became friends. I guess we became friends because we were both readers. There weren't too many readers in the Air Force. And so we exchanged books and ideas and talked. And once he said to me, we are fighting in an imperialist war. I was startled. What do you mean? He said, both sides are imperialists. Fascists are terrible. Now what about our side? The British Empire, the French Empire, the Dutch Empire, the American Empire, Soviet Union, Stalin. Well, what makes us think we're the good guys? No, both sides are fighting for imperial interests. It was shocking to me to hear that. I was so totally imbued with the idea we're on the right side. I mean, to this day, of course, I understand how soldiers make a decision at the beginning. I'm on the right side. Once you make that decision, you don't have to think anymore. You don't have to examine what you do from that point on. Everything you do is right. You can kill. You can drop bombs on Hiroshima, and you're on the right side. So I listened to this guy, and I said, well, if you believe that, why are you here? He said, well, I'm here to talk to guys like you. This startled me too, the idea that, wow, this guy's risking his life, to be, you might say, to embed himself in the military and to speak out against the war in which he's risking his life. Ironically, tragically, this guy didn't return from a mission some weeks later. Amazing. He gave me a book called The Yogi and the Commissar, by Arthur Kessler. Now, a book that's not well known these days, but Kessler,
Author of The God That Failed.
the author, yeah, he was in The God That Failed, so a lot of people know that, but they don't know the Yogi and the Commissar. But Kessler had fought in Spain. He had the credentials of a left-winger, so I could listen to him. And he was anti-Soviet, critical of the Soviet Union, and the Yogi and the Commissar. And he was it started me, I think, on the road to examining the war I was in. But I didn't do that until after the war. When after the war, I picked up John Hersey's book on Hiroshima, and I had seen the headlines of the bombing of Hiroshima when I had flown from Europe back to the United States with my crew. And we were having a 30-day furlough before going on to the Pacific. And we were going to continue bombing missions in the Pacific. And I had been married just before I went overseas, and my wife and I were going to spend this 30-day furlough out in the country, and stopped at a bus stop. And there was this newspaper with this headline, "Atomic Bomb Dropped on Hiroshima." And we were glad. Oh, wow, this is great. What's the atomic bomb? We didn't know. Just another bomb. I had been dropping bombs. Maybe this is a bigger bomb, but it sounds like this might end the war, so this is good, you know. That was my attitude at the moment. And then I read John Hersey's book about Hiroshima, and then it came home to me what that was. You know, he interviewed the survivors in Hiroshima, and you can imagine what the survivors looked like. The people without eyes, without faces, without legs, without arms. I mean, and the reality of bombing suddenly came home to me, and I was horrified because I had been bombing. I had never seen anybody down below. I didn't know what was happening to people under my bombs, because you fly from 30,000 feet high, you don't see any human beings. It's a mechanical, distant operation, which is what so much of modern warfare is like. People killing at a distance, people killing non-human objects, you know, and so I began to think about that, and then began to think about Dresden and the bombing we had done in Europe. It wasn't until actually years later that I learned about the bombing of Tokyo. I think to this day most Americans do not know that several months before Hiroshima, we firebombed Tokyo and killed 100,000 people in one night. So all of these experiences made me reconsider the idea of the good war. Is there such a thing as a good war? If World War II, which was the best of wars, the most clear-cut moral war, fascism and so on, if the most clear-cut moral war needed to be examined, then surely all the other wars. And that experience turned me against war, period. And after I came back from the Air Force, and my wife and I lived in a little rat-infested apartment in Brooklyn. I hope people in Brooklyn won't take offense at this, but yeah, there are rat-infested apartments in every big city. This happened to be in Brooklyn, and it's interesting how you leave the military and you go back to your life before. And if your life before was in the working class, even though you've been in the military and you've been an officer and you've worn good uniforms and eaten good food, and yeah, you're, as they say, an officer and a gentleman. And then the war ends and you're back in the working class, working at odd jobs, which is what I was doing. I went back to the Navy Yard for a while, didn't like it, worked as a ditch digger, worked as a waiter, worked as this, worked as that, and that was my life, back to my working class life. Decided to go to college under the GI Bill, and yeah, so I went to college under the GI Bill. I went to college in the daytime and worked 4 to 12 shift in a warehouse loading trucks, because while the GI Bill was wonderful and generous, you might say, it still wasn't enough to keep you alive. So I had to work, and my wife had to work, and now we had 2 little kids, and they were in a nursery and so on. So I went to Columbia Graduate School, got a PhD at Columbia, and then my first teaching job was at Spelman College in Atlanta. And the next 7 years were in the South, and living in the black community of Atlanta, 1956 to 1963.
Which was when the civil rights movement was starting to take off. Those
were very important years. Of course, I had no idea when I went down there what it would be like. I was just looking for a job. It wasn't that I was looking for teaching at a black college, And no, I just looking for a job, and this job came along. Oh, a Negro college, never heard of it, but a job. So we packed up our old Chevy and went down, and that was probably the most educational experience of my life. Being in the South in those particular years, went down in '56, which was a year after the Montgomery bus boycott, and stayed until '63, and could see the development of the movement, and became involved with my students. Even before the sit-ins, we were making little forays, the students, little forays into Atlanta against symbols of racial segregation. And and it was instructive. Instructive in showing actually that you could win little victories if you stuck at it. And some of my students decided they wanted to desegregate the Atlanta Public Library. Libraries were segregated, like schools were segregated, and the main library in Atlanta, called the Carnegie Library, was only for whites. They decided they're going to try to get in. And they would go to the library and ask for books. They said, we don't have these books in the black library. We'd like John Locke, an essay on human understanding. we like John Stuart Mill on liberty. We like, etc. The librarians are getting more and more embarrassed. Librarians are sensitive people. I suppose that's why they become librarians, right? Librarians, they're not going to get angry and say, get out of here. They find all sorts of excuses, But this campaign went on, and finally they broke down. And they desegregated the library, which was, a victory, amazing victory that just a handful of students had succeeded in doing. That was a lesson. And I became involved with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which was formed in 1960, and the sit-ins had taken place, and starting in February in Greensboro, North Carolina, and sit-ins spread to other cities in the South, spread to Atlanta the next month. And my students, my Spelman College students, very polite, very controlled. Spelman College was like a nunnery. It was, the students, it was, students had to go to chapel 6 mornings a week, compulsory chapel. Yeah, they couldn't double date until it was a very controlled place, and the idea was to take these young black girls from the South and move them into the middle class, teach them manners, really, like finishing school, teach them how to pour tea, wear white gloves, really, amazing. And what happened is when they got involved in the movement, and they broke out of Spelman College and went into the city where they had never really gone, because the city was a forbidding place. It was Atlanta was as tightly segregated as Johannesburg, South Africa. And but they went into the city and they sat in and they got arrested. And when they came back to the campus, they were on fire, and rebelled against the administration, against the rules and regulations. It was fascinating to see the change from passivity and courtesy and deportment, and from that to rebellion and anger. And so, yeah, I became involved with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which had formed out of the various sit-ins that had taken place throughout the South. And the SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, asked me to be on their executive board, along with one other person they considered an adult. We were the two adult advisors, I and a woman named Ella Baker, a black woman, a very remarkable woman with a history of organizing in Harlem and with the NAACP, and very wise. And so, yeah, I became I guess a kind of writer and participant in the movement, doing both at the same time. Going around from Atlanta, Georgia to Albany, Georgia, where demonstrations were taking place, to Selma, Alabama, to various towns in Mississippi, Hattiesburg and Greenville and Greenwood and Jackson. And writing about this and participating in it. And as I said, it was an educational experience for me.
You were ultimately dismissed from Spelman College.
Dismissed. I like that word, dismissed.
In 1963.
We don't say fired in the academic world. We rarely say dismissed. We say, what do we say? We say, oh, this contract was not renewed. But yes, I was fired. Let's put it bluntly.
And you had tenure. So
I had tenure. I was a full professor. I was chair of the department. Well, when you ask how is that possible when you have tenure, it's like asking, how can a policeman hit you with a club when we have a constitution? The law is one thing, power is another thing. And when I began teaching at Boston University, I taught a course called Law and Justice in America. And that was the theme of the course. This is law, and this is justice. This is the law, and this is power. And very important thing to learn. So, I was fired despite the fact that I had tenure and was chair of the department and was a full professor. And I was fired, and they didn't send me my letter until June. They wanted to wait until all the students were off the campus and everything was quiet. And that's when the axe came down. And so my family and I picked up our belongings and went north. And, there was a sort of consolation prize that, along with the letters telling me goodbye, said, well, we'll give you 1 year's salary, $7,000, so we could live for the next year on $7,000, which we did. Actually, moved up to Boston and had a year in which I did some writing and kept going back to the South and so on.
And after that time, you became more deeply involved in opposing the war in Vietnam. And
it was very good timing.
So tell us about the work that you did, and perhaps culminating in your trip to North Vietnam with Daniel Berrigan.
Oh, yeah. Well, becoming involved in the war, well, seemed natural. And here I was coming up north in 63, 64. There was in August of 64, there's the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which is the precipitating incident that brings the escalation of the war. But as I said, I was still going down. My wife and I spent the summer of 64 in Mississippi, Freedom Summer, where people came from all over the country to work on the right to vote for black people and set up freedom schools for kids and did all sorts of things. And that was the summer in which that infamous incident took place with the murder of 3 civil rights workers, 1 black, 2 whites, Cheney, Schwerner, Goodman. That took place in June. At least they disappeared in June. Their bodies weren't found until late July, beginning of August. Yeah, because we had, at the beginning of August, we had a memorial ceremony for them in Philadelphia, Mississippi, which is where they had been arrested and from which they were dragged out and executed. And people in the movement, in the civil rights movement, came from various parts of Mississippi to this memorial meeting. It was held out of doors. It was actually a beautiful day. And Mrs. Cheney, the mother of James Cheney, one of the guys who was killed, was there. And Bob Moses, who was the organizer, the SNCC organizer in Mississippi, a sort of a fabled organizer. And very quiet, but very courageous. And he got up on the platform at the memorial meeting, and he held up a newspaper. And it was that morning's Jackson, Mississippi newspaper. And the headline said, LBJ says, shoot to kill in the Gulf of Tonkin. and he said, so, ready to shoot to kill in the Gulf of Tonkin, half a world away. And federal government will not send anybody down here to Mississippi to protect civil rights workers, 3 of whom have just been killed. It was a very dramatic moment. And you might say, the beginning, in a certain sense, of the anti-war movement, convergence of the 2 movements. And in fact, the anti-war movement drew a lot from the civil rights movement, drew a lot of the spirit and feeling and hostility to the national government, and people who were in the civil rights movement became involved in the anti-war movement. And so I was there that day and became involved after, in what became a slowly growing movement against the war. In the spring of 65, which is a moment of important escalation in the war, we had a rally on the Boston Common against the war, and I spoke, and Herbert Marcuse, a political philosopher, spoke. 100 people. Wasn't a very big turnout, and I tell people about that when they complain that, oh man, we're not having a big demonstration. Look how many people showed up. People get disconsolate and so on. But yeah, 100 people. But then it grew and grew. Yeah, 3.5 years later, another meeting on the Boston Common, and 100,000 people were there. So yeah, I became involved in. I just began. I was teaching at Boston University. I was offered a job when I came that year that I was uh, living luxuriously on our $7,000. I was invited to teach at Boston University, and so I was teaching at Boston University, and at the same time very active in the anti-war movement. And therefore it wasn't easy for me to get tenure at Boston University because of that. It was a very tricky thing, but ultimately I did. Although that's a story in itself, but I won't go into it. One of those academic stories, you know how boring academic stories are. But yeah, I do a lot of speaking, writing. Wrote an article for The Nation called Vietnam, The Logic of Withdrawal. And Beacon Press, which had published my book on SNCC, suggested I write a book by that name, Vietnam, The Logic of Withdrawal. Because there was no book, a fair amount had been written about the Vietnam War by 1967, but no book called for immediate withdrawal from Vietnam. That was considered too radical. People talked about, oh, we can't withdraw precipitously. I love that word, precipitously. Even after you've been at war for 7 years, if you're going to leave, they say, oh, we mustn't be precipitous. So that's what they say now about the war in Iraq, right? We've been there, 6 years. No, we mustn't be precipitous. Afghanistan, we've been there 8 years, 9 years. No. So so I wrote this book, Vietnam: The Logic of Withdrawal, and I had just before writing the book, I'd been to Japan. I'd been invited by a Japanese anti-war group called Beheran, Japanese anti-war group, invited to do a lecture tour of Japan about the war, sort of representing the anti-war movement in the United States. And they invited me, and they invited a young black guy named Ralph Featherstone, who I had worked with in SNCC in the South. The two of us did this lecture tour, sort of 13 Japanese cities in 13 days, from Hokkaido in the north down to Okinawa in the south, all the way through Japan, every night a different city. And that was a great experience. The Japanese were far more against the Vietnam War than the United States. I mean, interesting when you think of it. Oh, Vietnam, communism in Vietnam, a threat. Well, yeah, Japan is much closer. If anybody might be threatened, oh, Japan, but no, the Japanese didn't see communism as a threat. And they saw the war for what it was, an attempt to extend American power in Asia. So I'd been to Japan, and so I wrote this book, Vietnam: The Logic of Withdrawal, which immediately went into like 7 printings and was distributed at anti-war rallies and was taken up and got a fair amount of publicity. One thing, the last chapter of the book was a speech I wrote for Lyndon Johnson. Of course, he didn't ask for it.
I'm sure not.
But, that wasn't going to stop me. I'm going to write a speech for him. And the idea of the speech was because everybody's saying, well, we shouldn't be in Vietnam, but how can we get out? Just what you hear now about Iraq and Afghanistan. Well, we shouldn't be there, but surely we can't just leave. No, and it's as if somebody had broken into your house and you said, get out. Well, I can't just leave. I wrote the speech for Lyndon Johnson, in which he explains to the American people why he is ordering our troops to leave. Very convincingly. Convinced me. But apparently convinced other people. And they reprinted this speech in newspapers and there was a businessman in Ohio who distributed copies of my book to every member of Congress and president and vice president, of course. It didn't stop war, but so I was writing, speaking, and that's what my life consisted of. And in early 1968, the North Vietnamese invited what they described as a responsible member of the American peace movement to come to Hanoi and to pick up 3 American prisoners of war, flyers, who would be the first ones released by the North Vietnamese. It was January of '68. It was the time of the Tet holiday, also the time of the Tet offensive in Vietnam. But in honor of the holiday, they wanted to make a goodwill gesture, they said, and they would release 3 prisoners if some responsible member of the American peace movement would come. And so I was considered a responsible member of the American peace movement, and Daniel Berrigan also. So 2 responsible members. That's better. And I had never met Dan Berrigan, but I met him. I met him on the morning that we were going to take the flight to Hanoi together. Met him in an apartment in Greenwich Village, where we'd been briefed by David Dellinger and Tom Hayden, both of whom had been to Vietnam, to North Vietnam. And so, so Dan Berrigan and I flew halfway around the world to Hanoi, stopping in 6 different cities and on the way. And spent a week in Laos because the plane that was supposed to take us from Vientiane in Laos to Hanoi had not arrived because it was supposed to take off from Saigon. There was a certain special plane, ICC, International Control Commission plane, set up by the Geneva Accords, and that plane flew 6 times a month to Hanoi. That's how regular schedule was, 6 times a month. Well, it was dangerous to fly to Hanoi. It flew from Saigon to Phnom Penh in Cambodia, to Vientiane in Laos, to Hanoi. And didn't arrive when it was supposed to arrive in Vientiane, where we were going to take it to Hanoi. It didn't arrive because the Tet Offensive had held it up in Saigon. The Viet Cong had taken over the airport, Tan Son Nhut Airport in Saigon. But finally, the plane arrived after an interesting week in Vientiane. With Dan Berrigan and I got to be real friends, got to really know one another. And then we flew to Hanoi, we picked up the 3 prisoners and brought them back to Vientiane. And anyway, after that, Dan Berrigan became very involved in the anti-war movement, and the Catonsville 9 and all sorts of actions of civil disobedience, and I continued to be involved in the movement.
And one thing that quite a few people may not know is that you, and through you, Noam Chomsky, played a role in the release of the Pentagon Papers by Daniel Ellsberg, these of course being the documents, top secret U.S. documents that documented the United States intentional misleading of the U.S. public around Vietnam. Tell us about how you became involved in the release of the Pentagon Papers, which really galvanized opposition against the war.
Well, I'd like to exaggerate my role, of course, but I'll try to tell the truth. I got to know Dan Ellsberg when he left the Rand Corporation, left the government, and had a kind of some sort of fellowship at MIT. And I suppose this was around 1970, 69, 70. And so I met him at one of these anti-war rallies, and we hit it off. We became friends, and he and his wife, Pat, and I and my wife, we became, again, going out together. And one time we were visiting him. He and Pat had an apartment in Cambridge, near Harvard Square. I don't know if you know this area, but we visited them in their apartment, and Dan says, I'd like to show you something. he had a sense of the drama. You know, Dan Ellsberg is a very dramatic guy. I mean, actually, he does dramatic things which hardly require over-dramatizing, but that's not going to stop him. He will dramatize the already dramatic, you know. Anyway, so he told me, he said, you know, I and my friend Anthony Russo, who also worked for the Rand Corporation, they had ordered this secret history to be put together of the Vietnam War, which to do it for the Defense Department. I had worked on it, and Tony Russo, and we decided we would photocopy 7,000 pages and make it public. And he brought out a bunch of these papers. So would you like to have some? And it's like, you know, like, would you like to have a drink or something like that? A polite thing to do. I said, yeah. So anyway, I took charge of some of these papers, and shortly after that, I guess it was, you know, early '71, that Dan Ellsberg and his wife Pat and Roz and I were going out to a movie together. We were going to see Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, which I think Dan Ellsberg had seen 6 times.
Goodness.
And when they came over to pick us up, we had a little apartment in Newton, and when they came to pick us up, Dan Ellsberg was very obviously agitated. And, what's the matter? And, well, he says, you know, I gave copies of the Pentagon Papers to all these newspapers, the Times and the Post and so on, and none of them had done anything with it. But tomorrow morning, the Times is going to print a bunch of the paper. So I said, why are you upset? He said, because they didn't tell me. And this was Saturday night. That Sunday, the next day, the Times, big headline. And of course, then the government began looking frantically for the person who had released these papers, and for a while it wasn't known. Then somebody exposed the fact that it was Dan Ellsberg, and then began looking for him, and he went underground. And in the meantime, while he was underground, some of us were distributing his papers to other newspapers, and I played a part in distributing the copy of the papers to the Boston Globe, which then printed it, and then he, at a certain point, he decided to surrender to the FBI in his little, you might say, little party in front of the Federal Building in Boston, where he and Pat showed up, and the FBI was there, and they were a little embarrassed because they hadn't known where he was, and and so he was arrested, and then he was put on trial in Los Angeles, and I was asked to be a witness in the trial because one of the things that had to be done in a trial was to explain to the jury what was in the Pentagon Papers, because the jury was being told by the government to release these documents, a danger to the security of the United States. I mean, that's the basis for the indictments. And he was indicted on 13 different counts for 10 years each, 130 years in jail. And his friend Tony Russo had helped him. He was also indicted. And so they had his trial out in L.A. in 73, and I went out to L.A. to testify in the trial. My job was tell the jury what was in the Pentagon Papers. So I actually had an opportunity to give a 4-hour lecture to the jury on the history of the Vietnam War, and to explain to them how releasing this was not dangerous to national security. It was just embarrassing to the U.S. government, and that's why they didn't want it released. And told them what was in, because the jury did not have the papers in front of them. Papers had to be introduced as exhibits, you see. So I had a job of telling them, this is what's in the papers. This tells you that the United States created the government of South Vietnam, which we claimed we were coming in to help them. No, we brought Mr. Zinn, the head of the South Vietnamese government, from New Jersey to Vietnam, set him up, gave him something to drink. And so the trial took place, and interesting trial. The government put on witnesses to say, yeah, this is a danger, and so on. And but then in the midst of the trial, the scandal broke around the Nixon administration and the Watergate scandal. And it turned out that Nixon had ordered his team of official thugs to break into the psychiatrist's office, Dan Ellsberg's psychiatrist. And because Nixon wanted to get something to show he was a nut, right? And if somebody has visited a psychiatrist, he must be a nut. Not like Nixon. So the break-in, news of the break-in, and the judge in the trial said, no, we can't let the trial go on. It's tainted by what the government did. So that was the end of the trial. And so Dan Ellsberg since then has been very, very active in movement against nuclear weapons and been arrested many times.
You are perhaps most famous to the general public as the author of The People's History of the United States, which was published in 1980, and which is a form of history from below. I wanted to ask you if you were influenced, or what your assessment is of another academic and activist, E.P. Thompson, who wrote The Making of the English Working Class, which was published in 1963, another form of history below,
yes.
From below.
Yeah, well, I was, of course, aware of E.P. Thompson. E.P. Thompson was to me an important figure, and sure, an example of how you dig beneath the official history and look at what working class people are doing. So, yes, I mean, it's not that precipitated me, but it was in my consciousness, and I had read it and admired it, and, I was probably influenced not by any academic work, not by any piece of writing. I was really influenced by my experience in the South, especially, and then my experience in the anti-war movement. Both experiences having persuaded me that the histories of our country were inadequate, that they left out the people who made history, the working people, the black people, Native Americans, women, and so yeah. I mean, for instance, talking about the influence of my experience in the South and getting me to write the book, when I was in Selma, Alabama, I contacted Columbia University, where I had my PhD. I knew they had an oral history project. I also knew what the oral history project was. It wasn't a Studs Terkel project. It was a project where they interviewed famous people, ex-secretaries of state, ex-generals, etc., and recorded their interviews. But I wrote to them, I said, you're an oral history project. There's real history going on down here. Really interesting people to talk to, not ex-generals, not ex-secretaries of state, just people involved in a very important and dramatic movement. So all you have to do is send somebody down here with a tape recorder. And, I got a letter back from Columbia University. Well, a very good idea. When somebody starts off with, that's a very good idea, you know they're not going to do anything. It's a very good idea, but we don't have the resources to do that. Columbia University doesn't have the resources. You know, it's like the United States government. It doesn't have the resources to build another school. You know, they don't have the resources. So anyway, I started taping. I was taping interviews with people in the movement, taping the evening in Selma, Alabama, and I think that helped sort of germinate the idea in me of history from below.
You are, of course, a playwright as well as a historian, and you've written a play about Marx in Soho. What's your relationship intellectually with Marx and Marxism?
Well, when I was, I suppose, 17, 18, and maybe it was my communist friends in the neighborhood who were always giving out literature and who gave me a copy of the Communist Manifesto. When I read the Communist Manifesto, I thought, wow, that explains a lot. After all, the Communist Manifesto is, it's not a scholarly, complex thing. It's very relatively simple and clear, Here it shows you the historical development of the human race from primitive communism through feudalism and capitalism and analyzes capitalism and shows you why capitalism fails and what's wrong with it and how it's a historical phenomenon. It's not a permanent fixture in our history. It came into being at a certain point and will leave at a certain point, will be replaced by a different society, a socialist society. Anyway, it all made sense to me. You might say it made sense of my own life. And so when I got together with my other three radical shipyard workers, we met once a week and read books. We read Marx and Engels. We read all sorts of things and discussed them. So, and later on I read Volume 1 of Capital. Even tried to read Volume 2 and Volume 3. Ooh. Maybe that led me to the conclusion that better not to write long and complex and difficult things, write things that people can understand. And so in my play, for instance, I don't know if you know my play, but there's a sort of exchange between Marx and his wife, Jenny, and she sort of shakes her head about das Kapital. No, she reads the first sentence of Das Kapital, which is so forbidding, the history of all societies, history of commodities and this and that. And she said, no, that won't do. You have to write like the Communist Manifesto. Anyway, I was very interested in Marxist theory. When I was teaching political theory. I taught Marxism. Soon I was teaching a seminar in Marxism and anarchism and comparing their ideas. And so, yes, I guess, that interest in Marxism led me to write this play.
You also wrote a play about Emma Goldman, and I understand that you identify as an anarchist. At what point did anarchist ideas start influencing you?
Well, it's interesting that you say I identify as an anarchist. I don't think I've ever specifically identified myself as an anarchist. Maybe I don't specifically identify myself as anything because I'm cautious about labeling myself, and when people don't know what the label means, and because the word anarchist suggests so many different things, so I don't want people to get the wrong impression. I don't want them to think I'm a bomb thrower. I'm a peaceful person. And but probably of all the political philosophies that there are, probably anarchism comes closest to my way of thinking. And I think when I try to think of when did I become interested in it, maybe even before I began specifically reading anarchist ideas, even before I read Emma Goldman's autobiography, I was already, for one thing, I was disaffected from the Soviet Union, from that idea of socialism, and therefore I was open to the idea that all governments are dangerous to human freedom, and that we need a society that's free of authority. But my specific introduction to anarchism came in the 60s, when actually I encountered a fellow historian named Richard Drennan, who had written a biography of Emma Goldman. I didn't know that, but when two academics get together, they say, "Oh, what have you written?" "Oh, I just wrote this biography of Emma Goldman." "Oh." I actually had read a little about Emma Goldman. Vaguely I knew anarchist, but I decided I would read his book, Rebel in Paradise. It's a wonderful book, and it excited me by Emma Goldman. Then I went on to read her autobiography, Living My Life, which is one of the great autobiographies, which later I would always recommend to my students. And so then I read Bakunin and Kropotkin, and so I was more and more attracted to anarchism because it was anti-authoritarian, and there's talking about labeling yourself and or describing what you believe in. And as I say, I've always had trouble saying, "Oh, I'm a socialist," or "I'm a Marxist," or "I'm this," or that. Well, I will say, "Oh, I believe in socialism," so long as I can explain what I mean. I'm a Marxist so long as I can explain what I mean. And but sometimes I will say, there's a 3-word description of how I feel. I got this from Dalton Trumbo. Dalton Trumbo, the Hollywood writer who was blacklisted and wrote one of my favorite books, Johnny Got His Gun, a great anti-war novel. And Dalton Trumbo was once asked, "Well, are you a communist? Or what do you believe in? How do you describe yourself?" I said, "What I believe in," he said, "is socialism without jails." 3-word. I thought, that's good. So I wrote a play about Emma Goldman, and the play was the longest-running play in Boston in 1977. It was interesting to me is that, anarchism is presumably a political philosophy held by very few people. Anarchists are on the fringes of society, but if you present anarchist ideas, present them through a fascinating character like Emma Goldman, people are all for it. They're interested.
Do you think that a synthesis of Marxism and anarchism, of the red and the black, so to speak,
Yes.
would be fruitful for the left now?
I think it would, yes. yeah, if you take the analysis of Marxism, of capitalism, and his call to action, his call for philosophers to change the world and not simply record it, and take the anarchist idea of being suspicious of authority and centralized power, and yeah, I think that blending of Marxist and anarchist ideas is something that is a good ideal.
I've read that you see the Paris Commune, that experiment that happened, short-lived, but in 1871 in Paris, that you see it as perhaps a model for what a future society might look like. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about the Paris Commune and why you view it that way.
Yeah, well, the Paris Commune was a situation in which, I guess, taking advantage of the fact that France and Germany were at war, and it was an opportunity for workers to seize the city of Paris and to take charge of the city and to set up a commune. They were called the communards, and they created a cooperative, egalitarian society in Paris where people traded things and and where there's no crime really. People had nothing to be criminal about. And where decisions were made by clusters of people gathering in the streets and then passing on their ideas to the members of the leaders of the commune. But the leaders of the commune were people who didn't get a salary which was greater than an ordinary worker's salary. And they created schools for women. There was no such thing as education for women at that time. And they had free admission to the theater. They made things available to everybody on an egalitarian basis, and they made decisions based on people getting together and talking and discussing, and it was an admirable society while it lasted, and then it was crushed. But there have been other instances like that in history which are models in the sense that, well, they give us at least a glimpse of what is possible. You know, Barcelona in 1936, early months of the Spanish Civil War, as described by George Orwell in his book Homage to Catalonia. Again, people sharing things, no crime. And what's interesting is in The Grapes of Wrath, which we were talking about before, at the very end, Tom Joad, who certainly doesn't know anything about political theory, never read anything about any of these things, but he talks about how in the government camps that were set up to help migrant workers, that people helped one another. And he said, there are no cops keeping order. And we had a better order than any cop could bring us, And so I think it's something that kind of society that people would welcome.
How do you think fundamental change can come about? Do you think that for a thoroughgoing transformation of society towards something like the Paris Commune or something else very different than what we have now, do you think that it would require some sort of thoroughgoing revolution, or do you subscribe more to the notion that gradual change can come from building a new society within the shell of the old?
No, I don't think revolution in the old sense of seizing power of the capital. No, we've had enough experience with that to suggest that that's dangerous and corrupting. And yes, I think building institutions, it's a slower process. Building free institutions within the old society, and so liberating the ground one by one, liberating this institution and that institution, and workers taking over industries, students taking over, and universities, people in neighborhoods taking over the running of the neighborhoods and the security of the neighborhood. I think it will come, not gradualism in the sense of, waiting too long, but yes, working to liberate society piece by piece from within.
Well, in your life, you've been very engaged with the question of organizing and how does one move forward, and you've argued that small moments can add up to the achieving of a great deal of social change. Now, reflecting with the really wide knowledge that you have of social movements over decades and your historical perspective on social movements over centuries, do you think that we can learn lessons now in the left or the radical left from the past in terms of organizing in a different way to engage people? I'm thinking, for example, about the anti-war movement, and you mentioned how people can get frustrated about the lack of effect. But you do have a situation where the society at large, or many people within the society at large, are against the current U.S. occupations, and yet transforming it into a movement that can bring an end to these occupations has been hard. So what lessons from the past do you think we should draw on now in thinking about organizing for the long term?
Yeah. See, I don't think it's a matter of finding some dramatically different techniques of organizing or protest, because, but I think the idea of people resisting in various ways, people refusing, developing there's certain tactics which are the most effective in confronting power, based on the idea that the people in power hold their power only because they are obeyed. When people withdraw their obedience, when people withdraw their support from the institutions, people who control these institutions become powerless. Notice with a strike is a fundamental weapon, because no matter how powerful the corporation, if workers go on strike, the corporation is helpless. This is what happened in the 1930s. People thought, oh, you can't fight General Motors or Ford. Look at, they're rich, they're big. No, workers leave the factory and they can't function. They are helpless. Same thing with consumers. When consumers boycott, this is a not sufficiently used weapon. It was used by Chavez on the West Coast, and the farm workers, the boycott of grapes, and it brought farm growers, these very wealthy, powerful farm growers, to have to recognize the Farm Workers Union. When Jesse Jackson threatened to call a boycott of Texaco because they had been guilty of racist practices, Texaco immediately caved in. They were worried. In other words, this is what they depend on. They depend on people to buy their products. You stop buying their products, they are scared. And then, of course, when soldiers refused to fight, which is what happened in the Vietnam War, they couldn't count on the military anymore. That's an aspect of the anti-war movement that has been underplayed. But the fact is that the GI resistance in the Vietnam War was crucial in making the U.S. government decide it could not carry on the war. So what I'm saying is we have to think about tactics that can overcome power. Have to think about what it is that holds these people in power, these institutions in power, and so developing these strike, the boycott, the refusal of soldiers in the military, and the building of institutions the building of cooperative institutions. Yes, the building of cooperatives, all kinds of cooperatives, farmers cooperatives, consumers cooperatives, housing cooperatives. I mean, all of that, you know. And yeah, it's a long process, but I think, you know, I think it can be done.
Do you think we should also evaluate and think about new ways of reaching people? You have yourself, well, obviously been deeply engaged in teaching and combining teaching and activism, but also I understand that you studied the use of documentary film in educating people. Do you think that perhaps the arts might be a more effective way of bringing people who are from outside of the immediate left in? And is that why you write your plays? Or
Yeah, I think the arts are enormously important, because the arts, what the arts do is they bring passion, emotion to ideas. And so the ideas are simply not dry, prosaic statements, but the ideas come alive on the stage or in music. And you know, when I heard Paul Robeson sing when I was a teenager, wow. Pete Seeger, and then in the 60s, Dylan and Joan Baez, and no, music, theater, movies. No, that art has a very special and powerful role to play, because it enhances people's feelings, and it gives strength to people's ideas and inspires people. So, yeah, I think that's one way in which people will be moved, and we have to consciously think about that in the future. Yeah.
well, I want to thank you so much for talking with me.
Well, thank you. Good questions.